Kiss Me Deadly was not just Robert Aldrich's most incendiary film, it was a Cold War detonation device disguised as a Mickey Spillane adaptation, written in contempt by a left-wing Greek-American novelist who hated the source material, filmed in under 3 weeks by a director who expected to be named before the House Un-American Activities Committee at any moment, condemned by the United States Senate as the #1 threat to American youth in 1955, and then mutilated by an unknown censor who removed its ending from every print in circulation for 42 years, until the director's personal copy, filed under lock at the Directors Guild of America, and accessible only after his death, was used to restore what had been quietly amputated. We are digging into the wreckage of Kiss Me Deadly, with 20 dark secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside congressional testimony, censorship filings, a 2005 documentary about the screenwriter nobody watched, and the University of California, Los Angeles Film Archive's restricted collection, where the truth sat, waiting for someone to go looking. The comma in Mickey Spillane's source novel, Kiss Me Deadly, was not decorative, it was syntactical. The comma transformed the title into a direct address, a command delivered by a specific speaker to a specific person, kiss me deadly, functioning as a line of charged dialogue between two people, the word deadly functioning as a term of address rather than an adjective. Aldrich and Bezzarides removed the comma. Without it, Kiss Me Deadly collapses the two words into a single compressed phrase, a modifier and its noun, deadliness as a property of the kiss itself, rather than as a name given to the person being kissed. The subtraction of a single piece of punctuation transformed a melodramatic invitation into a statement of metaphysics. All kisses are deadly. All intimacy destroys. What looked like a careless editing choice in the transition from novel to film title was, in the hands of two men who had decided to dismantle Spillane's entire moral universe from the inside out, the first act of systematic dismantlement. The novel's comma was the first casualty of a film that would go on to destroy everything else it touched, with considerably more force. Robert Aldrich arrived at Kiss Me Deadly as the son of a wealthy Rhode Island banking family, the nephew of Nelson Rockefeller, who had spent his formative years as an assistant director to Jean Renoir, William Wellman, Charles Chaplin, and most consequentially to left-wing filmmakers Abraham Polanski, Robert Rossen, Joseph Losey, and John Garfield on Body and Soul and Force of Evil, the most politically radical American films of the post-war period. All of those men had been summoned by House Un-American Activities Committee. Polanski had refused and been blacklisted. Losey had fled to England. Rossen had named names. Aldrich had been in the room with all of them, had absorbed their political sensibility and their artistic intelligence, and had waited for his own summons, which never came. Whether his family connections protected him, or whether he was simply too peripheral to pursue, the Federal Bureau of Investigation apparently never opened a file. He was surrounded by the wreckage of his collaborators' careers and emerged untouched, a fact he found both fortunate and, in his own documented assessment, uncomfortable. Kiss Me Deadly was made by a man who had survived the Blacklist intact, and used that survival to make the most politically subversive film the Blacklist era produced. Albert Bezzarides, born in Samsun, Turkey, to a Greek father and an Armenian mother, raised in California, author of They Drive by Night, received the assignment to adapt Spillane's 1952 novel under conditions he described with startling candor in the 2005 documentary The Long Haul of Albert Bezzarides. I wrote it fast because I had contempt for it. It was automatic writing. Things were in the air at the time, and I put them in. His contempt was the methodology. Bezzarides performed an act of systematic inversion, taking Spillane's hero, presented in the novels as a patriotic vigilante whose violence against communists and inconvenient women was morally righteous, and exposing him as what he had always been if you removed the ideological endorsement. Hammer in Spillane's novels killed communists, and the reader cheered. Hammer in Bezzarides' script blackmailed adulterers and pimped his secretary and tortured old men for information, and the reader was invited to observe, without cheering, what kind of man actually behaved this way. The contempt was the argument. The automatic writing was the most deliberately constructed screenplay of the year. Mickey Spillane ran into Bezzarides at a restaurant and confirmed what the documentary record establishes. He did not like him, not remotely. What Bezzarides discarded from Spillane's novel was the original plot's McGuffin, a briefcase full of drugs and mob money, a conventional crime narrative with no symbolic resonance. What he substituted was the great what's-it, a valise containing a glowing radioactive substance whose heat can be felt through the case, whose light blinds, whose contents incinerate. In a single narrative substitution, he had transformed a genre crime plot into an eschatological parable. The briefcase of mob money was a device. The glowing box was the atomic bomb. It was Pandora's box. It was the thing that everyone is looking for, that everyone calls very big, and that destroys everyone who touches it without discrimination or mercy. Bezzarides had replaced Spillane's McGuffin with the defining anxiety of 1955, the knowledge that humanity now possessed the means of its own total annihilation, and then denied, cheerfully and consistently, that he had any such intention. "I was having fun with it," he said. "I wanted to make every scene, every character, interesting. That is either the most sophisticated disclaimer in cinema history or the most precise description of how unconscious cultural anxiety produces great art." Before Ralph Meeker played Mike Hammer, the role had been considered for actors whose natural registers would have fundamentally altered what the film was doing. The casting of a conventionally attractive or conventionally heroic actor in the role, the instinct that had governed every previous Hammer film adaptation, would have preserved the ambiguity that Bezzarides and Aldrich were specifically trying to eliminate. They needed an actor who could make Hammer's brutality visible without making it sympathetic, who could carry scenes of casual sadism, the drawer slammed on an informant's fingers, the Caruso record snapped with a contemptuous smile, the old coroner roughed up for a key he had earned by cleaning Christina's remains, without the charismatic softening that Bogart or Lancaster would have automatically provided. Meeker was physically powerful, facially specific, and professionally underregarded in exactly the ways the role required. He looked like what Hammer was. He had none of the movie star equipment that would have allowed the audience to forgive what Hammer did. Aldrich had written into his contract with Park Lane that no studio representative could overrule his creative decisions. He used that contractual absolute authority to cast the right actor, not the marketable one. The film's entire moral argument rests on that casting decision, and the decision was made possible only by the contract clause that protected it. The opening credits of Kiss Me Deadly scroll downward from the top of the frame toward the bottom, in the opposite direction from every other film in Hollywood history at that point, accompanied by Nat King Cole's Rather Have the Blues, and then by a woman hyperventilating in darkness. The downward scroll is a formal statement. This film intends to move in the opposite direction from its genre's conventions at every level simultaneously. Everything in Kiss Me Deadly descends. Hammer descends through the social hierarchy from private investigator to punching bag to near corpse. Los Angeles descends from mid-century modern luxury to Bunker Hill rooming houses. America descends from post-war triumph into the specific anxiety of 1955 when the bomb was not hypothetical but operational and pointed. The credits run down because the film is about going down, and the only person in 1955 who noticed this formally was a French critic writing for Cahiers du Cinéma 6 months after the film's release. The critical reception in America was dismissive or actively hostile. Variety praised the exploitation value while noting the impenetrable plot. The Senate named it the #1 filmic threat to American youth. The Legion of Decency condemned it and demanded 30 changes. Aldrich made minor adjustments and wrote to the Motion Picture Association of America with thanks for their reconsideration, a piece of institutional diplomacy whose sarcasm was either invisible to its recipients or politely ignored. At the same time, the young critics of Cahiers du Cinéma were processing the film as the most significant American movie since Citizen Kane. Claude Chabrol called it the thriller of tomorrow. Truffaut described the film as operating like Henry Miller, facing a blank page, overfull with ideas, too fertile to contain. Both Truffaut and Godard would subsequently identify it as the single American film most responsible for the French New Wave. The film that the United States Senate had called a menace to its youth was simultaneously being recognized in Paris as the most important American film of the decade. The Senate reviewed the film they feared. The French reviewed the film they saw. The production's location work concentrated in Bunker Hill, the Victorian downtown neighborhood already scheduled for urban renewal demolition when the cameras arrived, was an argument, not a logistical convenience. Its ornate wooden houses, subdivided into rooming houses for pensioners and drifters, provided what Bezzarides had insisted upon: multicultural Los Angeles. As counterweight to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, the film was dismantling. Hammer's best friend was a Greek mechanic. His most reliable informant was a black jazz musician. His landscape was the immigrant and dispossessed city that the Chamber of Commerce's promotional materials never showed. The Los Angeles that Kiss Me Deadly photographed was gone within 5 years, demolished by the urban renewal already planned before the cameras arrived. Angel's Flight Funicular, the castle at 325 South Bunker Hill Avenue, the streets of a Victorian city that prosperity had failed to include, all of it demolished. The film is their most complete surviving record. Kiss Me Deadly belongs to a lineage of crime films about institutional paranoia that Aldrich absorbed through his collaboration with Joseph Losey, the director who had remade Fritz Lang's M in 1951 with Bezeride's writing. The structural deoxyribonucleic acid is direct. The city as a system of surveillance. The protagonist as both investigator and investigated. The they who are everywhere simultaneously. The final destruction that implicates everyone who touched the central object. Lang's influence on American noir runs through Kiss Me Deadly in every visual decision Aldrich and Ernest Laszlo made. The canted angles, the deep shadows, the spaces that contract around the people moving through them, this is Lang's grammar, filtered through Losey, arriving in 1955 as a denunciation of the America that had made the bomb. Aldrich never publicly acknowledged this lineage. The Criterion Collection's scholarly apparatus found it anyway. Hammer's apartment contains what film historians have documented as the first telephone answering machine to appear as a narrative device in American cinema. The machine, recording messages in his absence, playing them back during investigation scenes, is not a prop chosen for period accuracy. It is a formal argument, a machine that captures voices without requiring the presence of either party, that creates a record of contact in the permanent absence of the people it monitors. It is, in the precise grammar of the film's Cold War argument, a surveillance device repurposed as domestic convenience. Hammer's answering machine and the government apparatus that interrogates him throughout the film are not different systems. They are the same system operating at different scales. In 1955, no critic noticed. The machine was simply a modern detail. Seen from 70 years away, it is the film's most concentrated symbol of how the surveillance state had already moved indoors before anyone had a name for what it was doing there. The most extraordinary act of interference in Kiss Me Deadly's history was not the Legion of Decency's 30 demanded changes or the Senate's condemnation. It was the removal of 12 seconds of footage from the film's ending, footage that had been shot, that appeared in overseas theatrical prints, that was clearly present in promotional materials, which vanished from every American print sometime in the early years of the film's circulation, without documentation, without explanation, and without anyone apparently noticing for decades. In Aldrich's ending, Hammer and Velda escape the burning beach house and stand together on the shore watching it explode. In the truncated version that circulated in America from approximately 1956 onward, the film cuts directly to the explosion, implying both characters die inside. For 42 years, American audiences watched a film whose ending had been altered to impose a moral punishment the director had not intended. The restoration came in 1997. Elaine Silver tipped Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's archive team to the discrepancy. The team accessed Aldrich's personal print from the Directors Guild's restricted collection, and the missing footage was found. Aldrich had died in 1983. He never knew his ending had been recovered. The censor left no note, no order, no institutional acknowledgement that anything had been changed. The ending had simply been removed by someone who found its refusal of punishment insufficient, and then forgotten, and then found. Dr. Soberon's classical references, his explicit invocations of Cerberus, the head of Medusa, Lot's wife, are not decorative allusions. They are the film's structural argument stated in academic vocabulary for an audience he knows cannot hear him. When he tells Lily Carver not to open the box, he performs the precise function of the mythological warning that has always preceded catastrophe. The explicit, unambiguous instruction not to do the thing that will destroy everything, delivered to the person who will do it anyway. Pandora opened the box, Lily Carver opens the box. The myth and the film share not merely a plot point, but a diagnosis. That the forces of destruction are irresistible because they live inside human curiosity, and curiosity has never successfully been instructed not to look. Bezerides claimed no conscious mythological intention. Aldrich denied the more abstract readings critics offered. Both were describing the same process, how genuine cultural anxiety produces symbolic structures without the conscious architecture of allegory, how 1955 America's terror of Los Alamos found its way into a Spillane adaptation written in contempt by a man who thought he was having fun. Frank DeVol's score has received almost no scholarly attention, an oversight that becomes harder to explain once you examine what he produced. Working with spare jazz vocabulary and a predilection for dissonance and silence, DeVol created a musical environment that refuses the conventional noir score's tendency toward romantic fatalism. His music does not mourn. It observes, with clinical detachment, the sounds appropriate to a world that has lost the equipment for grief. The jazz passages running through the film's Club Pigalle scenes where Bezeride's explicit multiculturalism made audible, the non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Los Angeles the film was insisting on against the America a father knows best. Truffaut, in his 1956 Cahiers interview with Aldrich, spent more time on the film's sound than on any other technical element, noting that the sound editing was as precisely crafted as the image editing, that the two functioned as parallel arguments. Devol received no Academy Award nomination. He deserved one. The German television version of Kiss Me Deadly, never released theatrically, underwent an editorial transformation as systematic as the one performed on The Big Lift 3 years earlier. The dubbing eliminated every reference to Hammer's immorality, the blackmail operation, the pimping of Velda, the casual brutality toward elderly informants. What remained was a conventional, heroic private detective whose investigation led to an unexplained nuclear threat. The film that Bezerides had written specifically to expose the fascism in American masculinity was redubbed, in Germany, into an American masculine hero narrative. The country that had most recently demonstrated what fascist masculinity produced had edited the critique of it out of the American film that contained that critique and replaced with straightforward adventure. The result is precise and documentable. The same film in 2 versions, making opposite arguments about the same protagonist. The censor who removed 12 seconds from the American ending and the dubbing team that removed Hammer's criminality from the German version were performing the same operation, the removal of the film's argument in the service of an audience that preferred the version without it. In May 1955, Senator Estes Kefauver's subcommittee on juvenile delinquency, the same committee that had effectively destroyed educational comics, displayed Aldrich's advertisements during a hearing interrogating the Motion Picture Association of America's Advertising Code Administration. The film had been named the single most dangerous filmic influence on American youth of 1955, a designation Aldrich protested in writing, launching what production records describe as a sustained campaign for the free speech rights of independent filmmakers. The controversy generated by the Senate designation was, in straightforward commercial terms, the best marketing the film received. The grindhouse theaters that were always the film's primary exhibition venues filled with audiences who had read about the Senate's condemnation and wanted to see what had alarmed their government. The institution that intended to suppress the film advertised it instead. The film, designed to disturb American confidence in its institutions, had been given its largest platform by one of those institutions acting exactly as the film predicted it would. The inventory of cultural offspring that Kiss Me Deadly produced without credit or compensation is one of the more extensive in Hollywood history. The glowing briefcase reappears in Alex Cox's Repo Man in 1984 as a direct acknowledged homage. In Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, the golden glow from Marcellus Wallace's briefcase is the same golden glow in the same domestic container. When the Ark of the Covenant opens in Raiders of the Lost Ark and Belloq's face melts, Spielberg was working from the specific visual reference of Lily Carver in the Malibu beach house. John Frankenheimer's Ronin built its entire narrative architecture around a briefcase of unspecified but clearly catastrophic content. The Guardians of the Galaxy's McGuffin inventory includes the shiny blue suitcase explicitly. The great what's-it that Bezerides claimed to have written without intention has been cited, referenced, and remade across 7 decades of major productions. None of them paid for what they borrowed. The most commercially exploited MacGuffin in Hollywood history was invented by a man who said he had no intentions and was writing fast in contempt of his material. The restored Aldrich ending, Hammer and Velda on the beach watching the house explode, is not a survival. The substance in the box is radioactive material of unspecified but clearly catastrophic potency. The beach house at Point Doom has just detonated. They are standing in the surf in the immediate aftermath of at minimum a radiological event. They are alive, they are not safe. The ending the censor replaced with truncation was, on examination, even more nihilistic than the substitution. The truncated version killed them quickly. The restored version irradiates them and lets the audience calculate the rest. Both endings destroyed them. The censor chose the merciful version and called it punishment. Aldrich chose the honest version and called it escape. The critical reception of Kiss Me Deadly in America represents one of the more comprehensive failures of institutional criticism in Hollywood history, not because the critics were unintelligent, but because the film was operating in a register that 1955 American critical vocabulary had no equipment to receive. Variety praised its exploitation value and noted the violence without examining what the violence was doing. The Hollywood Reporter found it competent and commercial. The Senate found it dangerous. None of them located the argument. The British critics were more attuned. The Monthly Film Bulletin engaged seriously with the film's formal properties, though the British Board of Film Classification had cut 7 minutes of content so severe that the resulting film was partly incoherent by the publication's own admission. Only the French had the vocabulary. Truffaut's assessment that every shot contained a new idea, that the film was too fertile to contain, was the only review from 1955 that described what watching Kiss Me Deadly actually felt like. Everything else was beside the point. The Cold War ended and the bomb did not go off, and the Great What's It remained hypothetical, and Kiss Me Deadly aged from contemporary provocation into something more durable. A precise anatomical examination of how American masculinity, institutional power, and cultural confidence were all simultaneously performing certainties they did not possess. Hammer's certainty that he can navigate any situation through force is the film's central joke. He cannot. He is manipulated, beaten, drugged, shot, and ultimately carries Velda to shore while a nuclear device detonates behind him, no more in control of events than he was in the opening seconds. The Senate subcommittee, confident in its authority to define what Americans should see, was performing the same certainty with the same inadequacy. The box was already open. The committee condemning the film was the committee the film was describing. They reviewed the threat they feared. They did not notice they were the threat. The film that survived, made in under 3 weeks, written in contempt, starring the wrong actor, condemned by the Senate, mutilated by an unknown censor, preserved in the director's personal print in a restricted archive, restored 42 years later from 12 seconds of footage nobody officially admitted was missing, is the most precise document of American cultural anxiety in the decade that produced the bomb. Aldrich expected to be named before House Un-American Activities Committee and was not. Bezerides wrote fast in contempt and produced something that lasted 70 years. Meeker played a fascist with such complete absence of charisma that audiences could not look away. The Senate tried to suppress the film and advertised it instead. The French understood it before Americans did. And the ending, a censor quietly removed, sat in a locked archive for 4 decades, waiting for someone to notice it was gone. But here is the question that Kiss Me Deadly leaves radiating from its box, in the light that blinds and the heat that cannot be touched. If the most honest American film of 1955 about what the United States had built and what it was becoming, made by a Blacklist survivor and a writer who hated his source material, was condemned by the Senate, mutilated by an anonymous censor, and understood only by French critics who had not lived through what it described, then what does that tell you about who decides which warnings are legitimate? And if the answer is that the institutions being warned have always had the power to silence the warning, which film playing right now contains the thing your government has already decided you should not see, and how would you know if 12 seconds had already been removed? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Kiss Me Deadly, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.